Welcome back to Chapter 5 of Let's Talk Autism. And in this chapter, we're going to be talking about behaviour and self-regulation. I've already touched on self-regulation and sensory differences, but I want you to remember that behaviour doesn't happen in isolation. It's often a form of communication, which is the reason why I wanted to teach you how you can teach your child to thrive and learn and communicate, because those skills can replace challenging or problem behaviour. I want you to also keep in mind that your children are young. If they're under the age of 5, then it's typical for them to get upset, to have tantrums and to cry. But what we also want to do is to make sure that we're supporting them through these difficult moments and teaching them the necessary skills. But what I want to teach you is how you can observe what your child is doing and to perhaps better understand the triggers and the reasons why they may be exhibiting these different challenging behaviours. When we find the possible underlying causes and then focus on these, we can really bring about change. Learning about how your child processes information will help you make the necessary changes to the environment and to how you communicate, which will better support your child. So if you know that they're really sensitive to the buzzing of a fluorescent light, then it may be that you turn the fluorescent light off in their bedroom and use a floor lamp instead. As in the example with little Noah, he didn't like the feeling of the shower, but when we realised that the jug of water and the sensory input that gave was more comfortable for him, he was then able to tolerate his hair washing. Just to recap, in the previous chapters we learned different strategies and techniques that can be used to teach your child essential skills. Children can exhibit interfering behaviours. What we're going to do is go through an explanation of the potential triggers. Our goal is to teach replacement skills and understand what these triggers may be. We want to teach children and support them in making appropriate requests rather than screaming or crying for what they want. If your child leads you to an item, that's okay, but remember, you now have the set-go methodology to support teaching requests. If a child takes a tissue and anything that they can find in the environment that they like to twirl, you could suggest that they have one type of material, such a piece of tape, that they use instead. If a child doesn't like hugs, you could show them how they could do a hugless hug instead. I want you now to consider some of the potential triggers for interfering behaviour. So it could be crowded, noisy, distracting settings, new and unfamiliar environments or people they haven't met before. That can be really tricky too. A change in routine, having to wait, lack of predictability, and we've already shared how difficulty with transitions can be problematic, but how you can support these transitions with the different visuals and the other strategies such as priming that I've shared. Being hurried or rushed to do something can be really difficult for an autistic child because they don't have the time to get their body ready for the next activity. Activities that are difficult, frustrating, disliked or boring or even too long can be really tricky. So keeping this in mind, if your child's preschool teacher says he doesn't sit for circle time or he refuses to hold a pencil, this isn't because your child doesn't want to, but it could be that it's difficult for them or they don't understand the point. Another area of difficulty that can be a trigger can be when a preferred activity ends and they don't like to transition from an activity that is highly reinforcing to one that is less reinforcing. Another area of difficulty can be when access to something preferred is denied. So they've just had their dinner and they want an ice cream, but you don't have any ice cream, or they've already had dessert and you don't want to give that to them. That could be another time where we may see difficult problem behaviour. Part of our understanding is understanding through a compassionate lens. And prior to behaviour, we may also have different setting events. So a setting event could be something that's happened prior to the actual behaviour that we're seeing. So let's say the child's father is travelling and you as the mum have brought them into nursery, but usually it's dad that brings them into nursery. So this slight change may cause more anxiety and worry in the child because they weren't prepared for this change. And therefore, this is what we refer to as a setting event. A setting event, though, could also be that they're hungry and they skipped breakfast that day, but in the preschool, they don't know that that's the case, and therefore when the child gets really upset, they don't know why. It could be other sensory sensitivities, such as something that they don't really like the touch of. So the other children are playing with Play-Doh or playing with sand, and the child doesn't like that. You may also be a little surprised to know that for children who love water play, if their sleeve gets wet, then that can be really distressing for them and upsetting because it's actually a different type of tactile sensation. So I want you to really be detectives and look at what could those potential triggers be, and whatever we can do to avoid the trigger, we're going to try to do. Or even if we know that this has been a trigger, we know what we can do the next time. So let's say you're not able to drop your child off to nursery, and that's something you usually always do. Then when it's not going to be you dropping them off, it's a good idea to show them a picture the day before and say, tomorrow, mummy's not taking you to nursery, auntie's taking you to nursery instead, and showing them a picture of auntie. And when they leave nursery, to say to them, remember tomorrow, mummy's not bringing you to nursery, auntie's going to bring you to nursery. And that way they're primed and prepared for what's going to happen. Within a preschool setting, I've also seen children show problem behaviours when they don't receive enough attention from their teachers. But when they do exhibit the problem behaviour, they get lots of attention. So this is a really easy solution. We make sure that when the child is sitting and exhibiting appropriate behaviour, that they get a lot more attention from us. And when they're not, we tell them what we'd like them to do, or we teach them how to request attention. Look at me, look what I'm doing, or come see. Our theme throughout this course has been around communication and language and helping your child thrive. And it's also been about the changes that we can do and the changes that we can make in the environment. So on that note, I want you to think about positive directives. Again, a super easy strategy that everyone can do. And what this means is that you're asking your child to do what you want them to do rather than what you don't want them to do. So you're using clear, concise and concrete language, and you're using a calm, reassuring manner. So if they're running and you don't want them to run, you're not going to say, no running, mummy said no running. Instead, you're going to say, walk next to me, hold my hand. I want you to make sure that you always provide enough processing time when you do give a positive direction. Make sure that you always get down to their level when you're explaining that to them. And please also make sure that you're giving frequent positive feedback. This isn't necessarily praise, and I don't want you to say things like, good girl, good boy, but you can be really specific about what was expected and what they did. So thank you for holding my hand and walking next to me would be a way of the child knowing what was expected, that they followed through, rather than saying, don't run, or rather than even saying when they've held your hand, that's it, well done. So it's important to be as specific as possible. I also want you to remember to use your visual supports in terms of helping them understand the expectations. In the previous chapter, we spoke about using the incredible 5-point scale for a voice scale, but we can also use the same type of scale for a problem scale. Oh, I know it feels like a really big problem and an emergency and a number 5, but you know, I think this is a glitch. I think it's a number 1 and we can fix this together. But I know it feels really big. So what you're doing is honouring the emotion, but also helping your child know how they can problem solve and what you can do to support them and to co-regulate. The term co-regulation is really important because under the age of 5, a child isn't able to regulate their own emotions. They still need the help. They need the guidance. They need to understand how to label their emotions. And for autistic children, this is particularly an area of difficulty. You may have also noticed that I very slightly touched on working on emotions with young children. And the reason is that there are other really important communication skills that are necessary before we start teaching things like happy and angry and sad. And otherwise, children learn these in a really splinter way. So you can definitely point it out in a book. You can point it out when you see that somebody else is happy. Oh, I can see Daddy's really excited as he's opening his present. But it's not a good idea to show different picture cards at this age to sort of teach a label of an emotion. Otherwise, they learn it just as a word that matches a picture rather than in understanding it as an internal state. And as children get older, we then begin to talk about what does their body feel like when they're happy? Where do they feel happy? So they may say, oh, I feel happy in my heart. And what is it that you do when you feel happy? But this really is a skill that develops much later on. So just to summarize that section, I want you to be sincere in your praise and your encouragement. I want you to use clear and concise language. I want you to let your child know what you want them to do rather than what you don't want them to do. And as I shared, this is something really easy to do. So if your child drops the fork on the floor, you can say, pick your fork up, please. Thank you. If you notice that they look at you and they do it again, it could be that they like the attention and the game. So then if that's the case, you simply just remove it. I now want to share with you how we look at an interfering behaviour profile and the way a child can begin by rumbling, which is what we refer to as the escalating stage, and then that may rise to a peak stage, and then what we refer to as the de-escalation stage. So you'll see from this visual here where we use the positive strategies or the prevention strategies, and this helps you also see how it is an escalating stage. Now, what I want you to remember is when a child is in the crisis or peak stage of a meltdown, that's not when you can teach. Our teaching happens when a child is at their optimal state of learning. It's also important that we begin to recognize the different behaviors that we may see at the different stages. So in the rumbling stage, we may begin to see that the child begins to rock back and forth. Their voice may change. They may be more high-pitched. They may start whining. They may even lick their hand or lick other people. So the strategies that you use at this level are going back to your visual schedules, redirecting to the task, and perhaps even distracting them to something else. This is also where you can walk, but don't talk and take a break. So this is the opposite of a walk and talk. This is where you would take a walk and you would do that quietly without talking so that the child feels safe, but at the same time, it supports them in regulating. When children reach that crisis or peak stage, this is where we may see behaviours such as screaming, crying, throwing, hitting, even pulling their hair, hurting themselves or hurting others. At this point, we have to avoid adding fuel to the fire, and we want to make sure that everyone is safe. So this is where you support them by co-regulating. You can be close by, but use minimal words and try to avoid direct contact. And all you can really do is ride it out with them in a very safe way. As the child begins to recover, we call this the de-escalation stage. And this is where they can still be on edge. If you give a demand, they may bounce back into crisis stage. Remember, these are little children. They don't mean to do this. It's the means that they have in communicating what is happening and how to stop something. During this recovery stage, some of the strategies you can use is let the child relax and ease back in. Increase your level of support and then gradually reintroduce them into the activity that you wanted them to do. Now remember, the domain number 2 included difficulties processing sensory information. So our children are going to have sensory sensitivity. They do have sensory needs. That means that they may need to jump, or they may need to push something or push against a wall because they're seeking that proprioceptive input. Our children will have difficulty with self-regulation, and they're going to need our support as adults to support them through this. I want you to remember that these supports can be used across environments. At nursery, if they don't have a trampoline to jump on, they could go out on a swing. If they don't have a beanbag that they can sit on, they could have a little tent or a calming area in the corner of the room. The supports do need to be individualized, but we have to be the ones as adults that can support the co-regulation. I'd like to share a story with you about Sammy and the bright lights. Sammy had a really hard time at preschool from the very first day. His teachers reported that he didn't want to sit at the carpet, and he would cover his ears and eyes and put his head down on the carpet. He didn't respond to the teachers when they asked him if he was okay. At first, his teachers thought that he was tired, so they offered for him to take a break in the break area. But that didn't help. They thought maybe the language content of circle time was too difficult for him, so they tried an easier task instead. A story that he liked, but that didn't work either. Later, one teacher read a book by an autistic person who described being very sensitive to lights. To test if the lights were bothering Sammy, one day the teachers turned the lights off in the afternoon. When Sammy returned to the classroom from lunch, he sat on the carpet, he listened to the story, and when the teacher said, "Sammy, did the lights bother you?" he nodded for yes. After that, the teachers either kept the lights off or they only turned on a floor lamp instead of the overhead lights. They also talked to Sammy's family about bringing a baseball cap in so that he could wear it if the lights needed to stay on. So what does this teach us about children and the environment? What does this make you think about in terms of your home, or if you're a preschool teacher, your classroom? We want to make sure that we're providing positive behavioural supports. What does that mean? It means that we're trying to support behaviour by changes we make in what we say within the environment. So whether it's changing the lights, whether it's providing visual supports, whether it's being much clearer and concise with our language, incorporating the child's strengths and interests, all of these are considered positive behavioural supports for a child. So as a reminder, we can break down tasks into smaller, simpler steps. We can use positive directives and tell the children what we want them to do rather than what we don't want them to do. We can use visual supports such as schedules. This is what's happening in the morning. This is what's happening in the afternoon. We can use a first then. First, eat your vegetables and your chicken. Then we have the apple crumble. We can also have a to-do list where we check off the different things that they have to do. We can use different types of timers. You can play music on your iPad and set it so that when the music stops, it means it's time to tidy up. That can be really helpful for children who find sound timers really difficult and are more aware of the auditory stimuli. So you can have a favourite song. When that song finishes, it means it's time for us to transition and count to 10 and move to the next activity. Finally, I'd like to explain to you how you can use a functional behavioural assessment. This is something that I use within my clinical practice, and I teach my teachers and therapists how to use too. It's a way to help you understand the behaviours and then to see a pattern that may be happening, and then to be able to come up with an intervention plan. And the intervention plan can be things that you do prior to behaviour to avoid it happening, or perhaps changes that you need to make post the behaviour occurring. What we want to try to do is identify the triggers and really identify the function of the behaviour. What is the child communicating to us? Now, when somebody says to a child, don't scream, use your words, I always say to that person, if they could use their words, they would have used their words. And I find it really frustrating when people do say that, because I don't think it's very fair on the child. So what we want to do is observe what's happening first of all, and I want you to use this form to guide you with what's happening. So if you take a look at this form, we're first going to look at the setting events. Was there a lack of sleep that day? Are they hungry? Was there a fight that they had with another child? Are they anxious? Or perhaps you don't necessarily know what the setting event is. So the technical term antecedent simply means what is happening prior to the behaviour. So the child may be told to wait, and waiting is difficult. Or perhaps there's a presence or an absence of a certain person they don't expect. Or perhaps their favourite type of bread isn't available. Or they're given unclear expectations and directions, or they've gone to a new place and they don't know what's expected within that environment. So that would be the antecedent. The behaviour is what we see, but I want you to think about this in terms of an iceberg. So what we may see is verbal refusal. We may see crying, screaming, kicking, hitting, running away, or making verbal threats like, I hate you. But keep in mind that the trigger is going to be one of these antecedents. Now, for a behaviour to be maintained, what happens after is crucial. If a child is then given the item that they want by screaming, then unfortunately it's more likely that they're going to scream to get that item. If the task is avoided and they don't have to do it anymore, then they're going to exhibit that behaviour because that's how a task ends. So what I want you to do is to use this over a few days, particularly if there's a certain behaviour that you're concerned about, and this is going to help you better understand what the triggers are, what's happening after the behaviour, and you can utilise all of the different strategies that I've shared in chapters 2, 3 and 4. This is another SABC form where I haven't specified the antecedent, the behaviour and the consequence, but this could be more task specific and maybe something that could be used within a nursery. The preschool may look at a certain activity. So in the example with Sammy and the lights, it could be sitting for circle time. The setting event may be unknown. What do they see? The teacher starts reading a story when Sammy comes to circle time. The behaviour is that Sammy puts his head down. The consequence, he gets up from the carpet and story time. But once the teacher realised that it was to do with the environment and the lights, she was able to make that change so that when the antecedent was story presented at circle time, but the light was different, Sammy's behaviour was then different and he sat for circle time. Let's go back to our story of little Noah and how he managed to have his first haircut. If you recall, his father had shared with me the discomfort that he had had and what it felt like for him to have his hair cut. And we didn't want Noah to go through that too. So we watched different videos of children having their hair cut. We also played games like Tokaboka. There's actually a great hair cutting one that he really enjoyed playing. I also knew that Noah loved watching Fireman Sam. So after we had exposed him to watching these different videos, I showed him a pair of scissors and I also started just touching his hair very gently and then touching his head and seeing if the deep pressure really helped, which he didn't mind. He tolerated, he had a happy face, and he even asked me to do it more. He loved the squishes and the feeling of it. And then we set up a mirror and we opened up the iPad so that he could watch Fireman Sam. And I said to him, Noah, I'm going to cut just a little bit. So I cut a tiny amount of his hair and I showed it to him. And I let him watch more of Fireman Sam. And then I cut a little bit more and a little bit more and a little bit more. And eventually he had his first haircut. Now, I do need to tell you that I am not a very good hairdresser, and that is definitely not my strength, but it was done in a way that Noah felt super comfortable, and later on he was able to tolerate a barber cutting his hair, and now cutting his hair is no problem at all. I want to share a few other examples because these may be examples of things that you haven't necessarily considered that are sensory or to do with cognitive flexibility, and they may be potential triggers. So very early on in my career, I remember giving a child a biscuit and breaking it in half and offering them half the biscuit. The child was extremely distressed because visually it just didn't look the same. They wanted the whole biscuit. The two halves, the visual perception of it was very different. So the next time I made sure that they always had a whole biscuit. Another example is to do with toileting. So the act of actually toileting isn't often the difficulty that children have. It's actually more to do with the sensory component. So again, we go back to the gradual exposure. If we know that it is a sensory component, we can have the child just first perhaps play in the bathroom, sit on the toilet seat while the toilet's down, pull the toilet seat up, but sit on the toilet while they have their clothes on. I'm going to share a story about a little boy that I worked with who had a lot of difficulty sitting on the toilet. He eventually was able to pee in the toilet, but he really had difficulty having a bowel movement in the toilet. So what we did is we used this gradual exposure technique. So he sat on the toilet with his diaper, he would do a poo in the diaper, and then we would change him. And then we actually cut out a hole in the diaper so that when he sat, he still had that feeling of the diaper, but then when he did his poo, it sort of went into the toilet. So there are many ways that you can be creative and supportive so that it doesn't become a struggle for you and for your child. Gradual exposure can be really great when it comes to picky eaters as well, so that the children are gradually exposed to something. From a visual perspective, children sometimes don't like to have their food mixed up. So if they're eating rice and peas, they like the rice separate and the peas separate. And if you try to mix it together, they may not really like that. Another example is to do with cutting nails. So cutting fingernails, cutting hair can both have similar reactions for children. And what I find is sometimes using a nail file is much, much easier. And I've done that just with like a little song. So the nail file touches the child's hand, then touches their finger, then just one little finger. And if you exert that proprioceptive pressure on the finger and then just, go make a little song, swish, 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 or just tap, 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 the child is more likely to tolerate that. I had also shared that one of the potential triggers can be that the task is too difficult. And that's why when we were teaching the receptive skills, I showed you how you can provide different prompts or teach them in a more errorless way to reduce frustration. And I see that sometimes when children are trying to get like puzzle pieces in. So just supporting them and guiding them to do it can reduce some of that frustration. Now, of course, we don't want to always be doing it for them, but we do want to make sure that we're really balancing the support with the expectation, and of course, always thinking about building independence and building on the skills that we want them to learn. So as we come to the end of chapter 5, I'd like you to make a plan. If there are certain behaviours that you're really concerned about, I do suggest that you download the form that I mentioned and just write out what you're observing, and from that, see if there's a skill that your child is missing. So it could be that we want to support them in requesting, or that wait time is hard for them. So we're going to support them and teach them how to wait for something. And that can actually be done in a really fun way. Like you can even use the sign, wait, wait, here comes a tickle. And then the word wait no longer is so negative. Or for children that don't like the word no, and that's triggering, remember, you can use your positive directives. Hold mummy's hand, well done, rather than don't run. So what I want you to do is, first of all, go to your strategies in terms of the communication supports, the visual supports, the environmental changes. If you then can't quite figure out what's happening, then do go to the FBA form, fill that out, and you'll probably be able to see a pattern of what's happening with their behaviour. I wish you the very, very best. And it's been such a pleasure to be with you on this journey of Let's Talk Autism, helping your young autistic child thrive, learn, and communicate.